Right. So talking again about the project, just let's put it in its context, in its architectural context. So you'll have here on the user ends, right? You're interacting with some user interface implemented in whatever stack you choose to use, and that user interface will be usually interacting with some middle tier controller. Again, trying to break it up into the MVC design pattern, where the UI intercepts any interactions from the user and converting it into some events that the controller can handle. The controller will interact with a model, and that model will be made permanent into the database. Sometimes the data not necessarily is being the model is not necessarily only here in our local implementation, but it could be that it lives outside, right, on the cloud, right, that has its own database, okay, that has its own schema, okay, it has its own relations and which, when it comes back, needs to be converted into our models, right? We might have our own schema, they might have their own schema. So the challenge here is to understand what the mapping between the different schemas are, right? This schema might be a very flat schema, right? So it's denormalized. Whereas in our database, we've been taught to be very normalized, right? So ours is very normalized. Okay, so there will be a conversion between the data that we fetch from the cloud and how do we convert it back into whatever we store into our database before we store it. Okay, also between back and forth as we go between the different tiers. Here, way back in the data modeling, right? We're going to be very normalized. We're going to break out all the data into separate tables. But for representation purposes, oftentimes, as the data makes its way back to the user interface, we flatten it usually. We flatten it so that to make it easier for the UI to render it. Okay, for just to make it convenient for the user. Almost like we create a view. We create a view that aggregates various data from different tables, right? And just flattens it because it's more convenient to be consumed in a particular way. Okay. So what we're going to be looking at is the how different schemas can coexist together. Here, this schema might be an XSD, right, for an XML document that meets a particular schema, right, that then gets converted into our schema, which we're using a relational or NoSQL, and how these three different representations of schemas, and even a third one, right, the Java, we have multiple representations of the same data. Data that lives elsewhere that is using an XML schema that needs to get mapped to our relational schema that needs to get mapped to our Java schema, right? So we have 3 or 4 different schemas going around, right, that we need to convert between the different representations, right? And it's challenging. It's challenging to keep everything together, and what gets mapped to what gets flattened, what gets converted into different representations. But it's a very common issue. Okay, it's a very common issue that you have multiple data sets that you need to be able to manipulate. Okay. All right. So let's play around with some of this.